Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Triano, joined always by Stephen Canastracey.
Hello.
This is episode 35, and today we are interviewing Dr. Ralph Dudgeon. Dr. Dudgeon is the author of The Keyed Bugle and also Das Flugelhorn. He is a Keyed Bugle researcher and performer, and he is a retired professor from Cortland. So we are super excited to have Dr. Dudgeon on the Early American Brass Band Podcast today. And we can't thank him enough for taking the time to share his experience and expertise with us.
Yeah, definitely. It was great to hear kind of his music, his long musical career. Very, very active and still active. Even though he's retired from teaching at the collegiate level, he's still doing lessons and playing. He mentioned he's in the stages of planning for a new recording project, in retirement. So that's fantastic. It was a great conversation. We think you'll really enjoy it.
And a third edition of the book.
Exactly. Yeah, third edition of the book, all on the Keyed Bugle. So that's really neat to get that information out there and get an updated version of that. So if you like what you're hearing on the show, you can support us on Patreon and Teespring. Those are the two best ways to do it in a monetary fashion. But we're also on YouTube where we put up the full episodes and excerpted, shorter, more digestible parts of the episodes as well. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can just search the Early American Brass Band Podcast and give us a follow, so that way you can stay up to date on everything that we release.
And without any further ado, here is our interview with Dr. Ralph Dudgeon. Enjoy. So thank you so much, Dr. Ralph Dudgeon, for coming on to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. We're extremely honored and thankful that you'll take some of your time out this morning to speak with us. So thank you very much.
Well, it's nice to be here. At my age, it's nice to be anywhere.
So happy to have you. Can you maybe give us a little bit of your musical background and some of your musical upbringing and how you became interested in this field of early brass and keyed bugles?
Well, sure. Like Stephen, I'm a native Pennsylvanian. I was born in 1948 in a little suburb of Pittsburgh called East McKeesport. And my father was an amateur trumpet player. My mother was an amateur pianist. And they played music, before and after dinner, sometime before or after dinner, together. And that's some of my first memories of my father playing the trumpet, looking over my mother's shoulder at the sheet music on the piano.
Nice.
And he was a really good trumpet player in retrospect. He had a teacher named Patty Evanston, who was a cornet virtuoso, that I only found out many, many years later. And he didn't have Arbon's books or Clark's or anything around the house. It was all this big pile of sheet music by our piano.
Yeah.
And it wasn't too long into my own trumpet playing, as a little kid. I started, I think I was in fourth grade, 10 years old or something, that I realized that he was transposing everything. And not just, from C parts. You say, well, let's play it down a fourth or whatever. And my mother and my father were, had those kind of little games that they played. And we were churchgoers, and my father would sit in a congregation with me in the middle and my mother on the other side. My mother would be singing alto, and my father would be singing the tenor parts. And I'd look around, and everybody else is singing the melody. I'm going, what? Okay. And so I grew up, sort of watching my father's fingers. We would play together sometimes. And then I had a good music teacher in East McKeesport, a guy named Frank Stoffen, who was a pianist and a choral director specialist, but he taught all the instruments. It was a tiny little town. And so he taught elementary school, and I went to the elementary school that my grandfather built. He was a contractor. And as a matter of fact, the house that my youngest son lives in East McKeesport is a house that my great-grandfather built.
Wow.
So there are many houses in the town that were built by my relatives.
Wow.
So it was a musical school. Frank Stoffen had people, if you chose your instrument in fourth grade, and if you didn't choose an instrument, you were in his choir, and if you chose an instrument, you were in the band. And So there was like 200 kids in the school, 100 people in the band, 100 people in the choir.
Yeah, thanks.
And it just seemed like a kind of a natural thing. So Frank finally said, about when I was in 7th grade, it was time to study with a professional trumpet player. And he hooked me up with a guy named Eddie Shiner in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. Eddie taught at Duquesne, and he was an alumni of the Dorsey bands with his brother Matty Shiner, who was a trombone player. And they taught in a little old tenement house called Progressive Music Company in McKeesport. And my mother would put me on a trolley with a little white shirt on, and I would go down from my lessons down there and walk about a half a mile to Progressive from the trolley stop. And when I come back, she'd take the white shirt off me because it would be totally black with soot, because that's where all the mills were along the river. And but I learned a lot. Eddie Shiner was a real taskmaster. He made you sing everything before you played it. He would tap on the music stand with his pencil, and all his pencils looked like little beavers had chewed them up. And he had a darkened studio, and there were instruments hanging on the wall, double bell euphoniums, old cornets, and lots of his pictures of big band memorabilia and people and he had some famous students, as you might imagine, coming out of Duquesne University. And so he was a great teacher. But my father, the steel business was going under. This is in the early 60s, 61, 62. The steel business was fading there, and he got a job offer for an aircraft company in California. So I went along with my family to California when I was about 13. And it was like I'd died and gone to heaven, because this little mill town in Pittsburgh Pittsburgh was kind of a depressing place at that time. Anyway, so I got interested in. I had a great high school band. In Chula Vista, California. I could see the Tijuana Bull Ring from my backyard.
No, well.
There, so we were close to the border, about 2 miles from the border. And so there's a mix of cultures and stuff, and I got involved in music. Was the center of my life in high school. I was a band geek, and I was in a bunch of rock bands and things like that. And I studied with a guy in Chula Vista named Bill Bowers, who was a gentleman from New Orleans. And he played cornet in the style of Herbert L. Clark, and he could play Dixieland stuff. And he, at one time, I think he's the only person I ever heard of that played first trumpet in the San Diego Symphony, and he also played first trombone in the San Diego Symphony at a different time.
Oh, wow.
So, he was a very versatile guy, and he was hooked into the gig scene in San Diego. And so I had a very good high school band. They would win these parade competitions, and the year that I was a senior and band president at Hilltop High School, they won the award at the Maytime Band Review to go to the Tournament of Roses parade.
Nice.
And in college, I studied with Louis Campiglia, who was a trumpet player in San Diego, and it was at San Diego State. And Dave Greeno, who was then first trumpet player in the symphony, lived right across the street from my parents in Chula Vista. And so I'd often, tag along with him on gigs and things, and we'd go to, before there was an International Trumpet Guild, we'd go to these meetings in Colorado, the trumpet symposiums that were at the University of Colorado in Denver, I believe. And so we were, trumpet buddies, and he was my sort of a mentor to me. So in between my BA and my master's, I started studying with a guy named John Kleiman in Los Angeles. John had been he was first trumpet player in the LA Philharmonic from 48 to 1968, and then he retired after a series of heart attacks. And he taught at some of the other colleges, but he always gave lessons in his house it was right off Sunset Strip Boulevard in Los Angeles, and I studied with, I would sit in the waiting room with people like Lee Laughlin, from Chicago, from the rock band.
Yeah.
Other trumpet stars would be waiting for their, and people in Las Vegas would get together and fly John out for a master class.
Yeah.
So he was, and John was real straight too. He really didn't mince any words with when something was not good.
Yeah.
So he was, and I studied with him pretty much until I left San Diego. I got my master's in performance with Jack.
This is referring to Jack Logan, Dr. Dudgeon's teacher for his master's degree.
And I was studying in addition with John. And then when I started working in the symphony, I started in the summer seasons with Dave Greeno, my neighbor across the street, and back and sitting in pits and stuff with him. And at that time, San Diego, it was the same group of musicians that played the symphony, the ballet, the opera, and in the late 60s, San Diego Opera was really going strong. Tito Capobianco was the artistic director, and Beverly Sills was singing Norma. I played the backstage group when she sang. Norman Tregel sang Mephistopheles, and it was really a rich environment. Yeah. So I lived on a hill. It was about 5 minutes from the opera house, from the theater, Civic Theater, and I could get down there. And my first job was a phone call. So and I just got back from the Aspen Music School, where I studied with Jerry Schwartz.
Okay.
And I got a phone call. Said, "Are you warmed up?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you get down to the hall. You're leading the offstage brass for Norma."
There you go.
Wow.
And we got a call from Joseph Getvai in San Francisco. He's in a car accident, and he won't be there. You're our trumpet player. And I got to the gig, and it was one of those things where you're backstage with a remote thing, and I had been, John Kleinman had taught me how to play loud. All these layers of curtain between the band, the offstage band, and I don't know why I'm remembering this stuff now, but anyway.
It's a good story. I like it.
But I came, I got there, and I had just, I knew the music. I'd listened to Norma millions of times, and we finished the dress rehearsal. The contractor, who was a percussionist, came back and gave me a big hug, and he said, "If there's anything I can ever do for you," and he said, "Tonight you saved my ass." And I worked the rest of the season. If there was ever an extra trumpet player or whatever in any of those orchestras, I played the opera, and I was what you would call a utility player. So I got in the orchestra without ever auditioning.
Yeah, there you go.
It's the ideal way to do it.
Yeah. And when I came back from Aspen that summer, I would be sitting in the orchestra, and we'd have, like, Werner Torkanowski was one of our conductors, and he recognized me from, and he would come back and talk and chat with the brass section and so forth. And we had Aaron Copeland conducting, and Copeland had been at Aspen, and I had been in a brass quintet that read Copeland's. His composition students were.
Oh wow.
Were trying out brass. Their assignment was to write a brass quintet, and we would sit and play, and sometimes Copeland would show, and sometimes it was just the students, and then but I got, and Copeland came back and he said, Ralph.
Nice. That's cool.
And all of these, I was about 22 years old or something, and probably one of the younger members of the orchestra, if not the youngest, and everybody's going, where does he know these people from?
Yeah.
And so that started my orchestral life, And I never looked back after that. I just always would get on the sub list in a town and play in the orchestra until I got on the orchestra in the
Yeah.
orchestra. And
Yeah.
so now it's pretty much the same story now.
I'm curious with, I believe it was your first teacher who had the double bell euphoniums and the cornets and stuff on the wall.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe planted a seed in the back of your mind of kind of like the older instruments or some of the novelty instruments that might have kind of crept up a little bit later for you?
Yeah, I think that was in college mostly. My first instrument was a bugle that I bought from my scoutmaster. I was probably about 12 years old, and I bought it for $6.
Yeah.
I still have that too, along with my father's King's H.N. White silver flare trumpet. Anyway, yeah, but it was in college that I really started. I played in the Harry Partch Ensemble that was rehearsing for an opera and all these weird instruments, and I started it, and I was very interested in the Collegium Musicum that we had. I was told that as a trumpet player I wouldn't fit in with a Renaissance dance band at all, and so they made me. The director of the group gave me a book by Steps that was 9 recorder studies, and he said, if you can play this book on your alto recorder, we'll let you in. So I and it's a difficult book. Hans Ehrlich Steps. And so anyway, I played the recorder, but I loved all those other instruments. I loved the crumhorns and the shawms and the sackbuts and particularly it was in the 60s. So the people that were in that group were different than the people that were in the college orchestra or the college marching band. They were people that wore. The girls wore Mexican wedding shirts and played the harp, and they were beautiful and had long, gorgeous hair. And they improvised, and it was, they had they would play, Cantigas de Santa Maria or the music from Alfonso X, and start improvising on that. And the people that were in that group were all, they were composers and people that later continued in the music profession, not just as teachers, but as performers, and that sort of got real serious about it. We had people like Michael Culver, who's a cornetist, that went to Basel and studied in the Schola Cantorum there, and became a famous cornetto virtuoso with Bruce Dickey.
Yeah.
So it was. I was more fascinated with the instruments as sculpture. I started making instruments and things like that. And then the collecting kind of started. Sort of old cornets. Anyway, the Keyed Bugle started. I was between the masters and and I was teaching, and it was a period of time before I started. I couldn't really think of a good doctoral project. I knew that Ed Tarr and Don Smithers had worked on the Baroque trumpet stuff, and my friend Michael Culver and Bruce Dickey were writing the cornetto, were studying the cornetto repertoire. I liked the cornetto, I played the cornetto, and I liked the natural trumpet, but I didn't want to infringe on other people's research territory.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find a niche. I visited the Smithsonian. My wife Ginger, who's also an early musician, who I met in the course of all of this, her parents lived in Falls Church, Virginia. So we would visit them often. I would go to the Smithsonian, and I met Robert Sheldon. And I was originally I wrote a letter and got an appointment with him to look at the natural trumpets that were in the Smithsonian. And of course, there's that's basically an American collection, and by that time they're the natural trumpets are not that great. But we were in the back room, and he gave me a set of white gloves, and he says, we had this guy named Bob Eliason over here. He wrote a postdoc thing on the key bugles in the United States, and he showed me a copy of this, and he said, these instruments are beautiful, they were well crafted, and they play great. Here's a pair of white gloves. I have to do some stuff. So he was gone for about 20 minutes, and I was tooting around on this thing, and I started playing Caro Mio Bane and some of the little opera tunes that I knew, and he came back, and I was playing the keyed bugle, and so he recommended a couple of people. I got pretty enthusiastic about it, and of course at that time I had a little bit of time on my hands. At least I thought I did. I was playing third trumpet in the symphony. He goes, well, you're not principal trumpet. You have time to practice it.
There you go.
And I was teaching during the day, and so he gave me a couple of names of collectors, and I got in touch with a guy named Bill Gribben in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and I bought a couple of keyed bugles from him for about $250 a piece. And I got a local music guy who was an alumni of the Allentown Band, by the way.
Oh, wow.
A guy named Keeler to restore these things, because he was a famous woodwind player. My sister was a clarinetist, and she had all of her clarinet work done by Mr. Keeler. So I started playing it, and by the bicentennial, I had a little band together, and we were playing stuff. And Sheldon invited me to the Smithsonian to play, and there had been a couple of recordings made by Judith Plant, and Bob Sheldon himself did a Stephen Foster album where he played a little keyed bugle. And so it was sort of something in the air. And also the other thing about it, by this time I was getting serious about a dissertation topic, and you guys know, you're studying this stuff, that you have to delimit your study.
Yeah.
You can't study everything.
Right.
You gotta, if you're going to write a dissertation, you gotta narrow it down. And I thought this is the perfect topic for study, because it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. At that time I thought the keyed bugle was invented by Joseph Halliday, and in 1810, and by 1870 it was no longer there. And so that was my premise. And I had no idea what kind of a rabbit hole I was going down with the dissertation and so forth. So but for the time that that I was writing that dissertation, it was a great topic, and no one else was researching it. Bob Eliason was on to the Henry Ford Museum and doing other things, and and he was one of my first sponsors. One of my early concerts on keyed bugle was at the Henry Ford Museum with
cool.
Bob playing Ophicleide.
Nice.
So so there was a lot of support in the museum community for this kind of thing, and there's a controversy whether we should play these things at all because they're artifacts and so forth. But that's at the time I was studying, you could walk into a museum, put on a pair of cotton gloves, and play whatever you wanted.
Yeah, there you go. So I know you said that the research hadn't been largely delved into yet, besides Bob Eliason, before you kind of got into it. Were there players before you of the instrument, of keyed bugle in particular, I mean?
Yeah, there was a woman named Judith Plant, and she played it with Fred Benkovic in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Okay, gotcha.
And she did an album for, she was among a group of people that did an album for the New World Records called Come Trip It. And it was, popular songs, and she played some quick steps and things like that. She played the keyed bugle. When I met her, she was in possession of a tortoiseshell bugle that was basically a high B-flat piccolo keyed bugle. It was made out of tortoiseshell. And so she So she was an early pioneer, and of course Bob Sheldon himself recorded before I did. And in 1984, I did the first solo album project that was devoted to the music for the Keyed Bugle. So that,
Gotcha.
but there were certainly people before me, and there were probably people in vaudeville and so forth that used this as used the Keyed Bugle as a novelty thing.
True.
I've just was looking at one little bio sketch of a performer that was reported to have played Keyed Bugle in a circus in 1890. So there's an argument that it never actually went out of performance. I met the great grandson of Halliday, who took out the patent for the instrument in 1810, and he played the Keyed Bugle. He was 80 years old when I met him.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. And he had a couple of Keyed Bugles around. I should kick myself now, but I could have bought an ophicleide and a Keyed Bugle from him. He sold it to Gribben, and that's how I met him, through Gribben.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned the Halliday name a few times, and you mentioned how with your research you kind of had the idea of the bookends with 1810 being the beginning of it, and then so on. And you're alluding that there is more to the story. So can we maybe fold in maybe two of my questions into one? One is, what is that actual origin kind of story of the Keyed Bugle? And then to fold in kind of the second question, which they may be related, they may not. What do you see as the difference between Keyed Bugles and Keyed trumpets?
Okay, well, there now appears that there was an ad in a London paper for a bugle with keys as early as 1800, and the person who put that ad in was an instrument dealer named George Astor. He was originally from Germany, and he was familiar with bass horns that were keyed low brass. You guys know about bass horns, and serpents and things like that he was selling. And he probably would have been aware of the early experiments with the keyed trumpet. Now, keep in mind, this is in 1800. Okay. 10 years before Halliday patents his improvements on the Keyed Bugle. And so I think the Hummel concerto dates from 1804.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of the theory that I'm kind of proposing now is that this was sort of a mix of people who were sort of brainstorming across cultures for how to make a chromatic brass instrument. And it's kind of like the story is looking a little bit more like the story of how the automobile was invented. It wasn't invented by just one guy. There was Oldsmobile and there was other guys. And there was a fire, and the internal combustion engine of the Oldsmobile that could get out of the fire was the one that survived, and that's why we're not driving electric Oldsmobiles today.
Right.
So at any rate, it's that kind of a complexity in the storyline, and it puts Halliday in a place where he made improvements in the instrument. His associates took advantage of this. There were other people that were that he knew that were in his band and probably trusted that probably took advantage of this situation and probably shared this information with instrument makers. We know from court documents of disputes about the patent and who was licensed to produce the instrument, that there were all kinds of complex relationships. And Halliday himself, I got his story, from his great grandson. But 4 generations of the family retelling this story, sort of put it from the Halliday perspective rather than anything else.
For sure.
So so after the initial shock of seeing this ad in 1800, and we should, basically change my narrative a lot. So
Interesting.
now in the third edition of the Keyed Bugle book, if I ever, when I get it done, it'll be a much more complex, rich, and nuanced story about how this all happened.
Gotcha. I know a lot of history telling, with our OCD mindsets, we would like for there to be like clear beginnings and
Yeah.
clear stories, but unfortunately, or fortunately, it's the truth. But, unfortunately, in some instances, history is a lot muddier than that, and dates and cleanliness isn't as clear as maybe we would hope.
Yeah. Well, we say we write the history we need.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true.
But I was, and then I started thinking about Bob Eliason's early book on the Keyed Bugle in the United States. He actually talks about 4 or 5 different origin stories, and many of them could be true.
So kind of to clean it up, I guess we say that the instrument likely existed before 1810, but to kind of have some fact and definitiveness in there, we say that 1810 is just the first patent filed for the instrument. Then.
And Astor himself died in 1813. I think I have that date right. So if he and his brother, who was part of the firm, moved to America. So so it could be that just the nature of business and so forth, that he never really got to fully produce lots of these instruments. Although I did see an E flat, small, I think it was an E flat, that was marked Astor in Tony Bingham's shop about 20 years ago. So that was new to me at that time, and it's got me thinking about it. But the last 10 years, it's become a more nuanced thing. The keyed trumpet that Weidinger and others were experimenting with is a natural trumpet that was common. It was double wound, common in the classical era, that would be fitted with crooks for various keys. And going from high E flat down, and it's very similar in its physics to the English slide trumpet that Harper was using and so forth. But it has keys like a woodwind instrument, and there are usually 4 or 5 of them. And the instrument can be crooked from higher pitches down. As a matter of fact, when you play the Hummel, there's a part in the Hummel concerto where it's in E in the beginning, and people have often wondered why it modulates to C in the slow movement. And you can just switch your crooks to a C crook and play it perfectly well. And so, at any rate, it was a very versatile instrument comparatively. And it was played by a number of people. It was used in harmony musique, and particularly Italian opera, and there were the famous Gambatti brothers who were in New York and in London before that, Italian trumpet players that played key trumpets. So that's one instrument. Now the key bugle is a conical, single wound instrument that has up to 12, or there's even one with 13 keys. 7 keys make a keyed bugle chromatic, fully chromatic.
Gotcha.
So if you're looking for a keyed bugle, you want to find one that has 7 keys. And there are a number of different styles. And as you can imagine, some of the confusion of the early makers of the instruments, there were all kinds of little improvements that were put forth. And there are, in my book, I talk about maybe 10 different body styles that take place. But the principle of the keys is basically the same.
Gotcha.
And it has an open standing key that is closest to the bell on almost all of them, and it's fully chromatic. So it's a little bit, because you're blowing a 4-foot pipe rather than an 8-foot pipe, you're dealing with the initial partials, and because it's conical, it's basically the same dimensions as a modern flugelhorn bell. So it has
Makes
a
sense.
kind of a woolly Chet Baker flugelhorn kind of a sound that is different from the keyed trumpet, which has more of the natural trumpet qualities, except
Definitely.
except that it's vented. So that's the main difference, basically.
Yeah.
And so the repertoire is different. The instrument is different, acoustically and physically.
Gotcha. When the keyed bugle kind of came on the scene, was it picked up right away by players, or was there some skepticism surrounding it, or anything like that?
Well, this was a time, the first key bugle player that showed up in the United States that we can find. There may be even earlier ones now that we know that key bugles started a little earlier than we thought. But Richard Willis arrived in the United States in 1816, became the director of the West Point Band. I think he's buried at West Point. And and he seems to have. I've been reading, the New York papers now that they're all digitized.
Yeah.
You can go back and he performed a lot in New York City, and he had students, and he ordered instruments for the West Point Band, and performance reviews seem to be pretty positive. On the other hand, the Gambatti brothers, the guys who are playing the keyed trumpets in the opera, they faced a lot of negative criticism. So I think audiences, especially in America, were open to new things. But also in Europe, there was if you read Hofmeister's catalogs and so forth, there are lots of advertisements for new instruments, and many of these new instruments, newly designed instruments, were what we would call novelty instruments today, but double flageolets and things like that. But the people that played them were respected symphony musicians, were people that were in the opera orchestras and so forth. So so there was a kind of a feeling in the air for something new, something that involves science.
Yeah. Do you think that a lot of these orchestral musicians were so eager to try these instruments because they wanted to be the first one if the instrument happened to take off, type of thing, that they were the first ones to kind of popularize it?
Well, let's say if I was an orchestral musician in 1810, and my job was playing dominant and tonic notes in a Mozart opera for looking forward to the rest of my life. Maybe I'd like to do something a little bit more chromatic. Right. And also, music was so these instruments really expanded what you could play, and the repertoire for the keyed bugle really was involved in this, both the popular tunes of the day, Irish jigs and things like that, quicksteps and so forth. But when they played on programs, they played opera arias, and they played variations on opera themes, and so the Italian opera influence on a lyrical playing. The method books say that the keyed bugle is supposed to sound like a fine tenor voice, and so the idea of having a vocal model was a very 19th century idea. The other thing was that the long trumpets, the natural trumpets, were part of a tradition that came from guilds and military use of the instrument. And all of a sudden, you had an instrument that any citizen, any democratic citizen of the United States, or for that matter England, could just pick up and buy a method book for and learn it themselves. Maybe with the aid of some help from a good brass player, but it was what I would call a more democratic instrument. And there's a wider range of people that could play it. That were permitted to play it.
Right. True. Now, were there makers in the United States of the keyed bugle, or were they kind of one of those instruments that was being primarily imported?
Well, there were a lot of imports initially, but the United States had the advantage of great water power and a great network of and of course a large body of workers. So there were firms like Graves and E.G. Wright in the Boston and New England area.
Right.
There were a number of other people that and there were a lot of immigrants. There were a lot of German-made instruments and German instrument makers that were coming from places like Mark Neukirch and in the area that's now right on the Czech and German border. And as a matter of fact, that in that area, Vogtland, they call it Musikstadt. Because everybody there makes instruments.
Yeah.
and everybody has been making instruments there since the late Baroque times. So there's B&S Challengers, and all those instruments are made there in an industrial park. But in the 19th century, they had their own American consulate, and they sold instruments to America by the ton.
Wow.
They didn't measure instruments. They didn't say so many keyed bugles or so many harmonicas or whatever. They sold it by weight. So that did not, that they would have their own, almost an embassy there to facilitate that trade. It gives you an idea of the volume of European instruments that were coming into the United States. And they came into places like Bethlehem. So some of the instruments that that have American makers' names on them, if they have German names especially, they probably came from Mark Neukirch, and there was a trade back, and then the Allen valve, the string action rotary valve, went back to Europe, and now that's the dominant French horn connect, the rotary valve that's used in French horns. So so there's this flow to America of tradespeople and makers and players, and then there's this flow back of ideas, of improvements, of things. So Saxony and Vogtland and Mark Neukirch and Klingenthal, Adorf, Graslitz, all of those places are making instruments for the world. Now that doesn't include Paris too, which is Paris and London are also exporting. We had a little bit of trouble with England,
just a little bit.
during the War of 1812. I refer to the War of 1812 to an English person and go, "What?" And I think in England it's called the American War of Insurrection.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And I said, "Yeah, that's when you burned our capital, remember?"
Yeah. And, yeah, very true. It's always interesting because we can get so in the weeds and tunnel visioned with brass instruments and dates and locations and stuff, and we always see that that Halliday 1810 date, and then like the 1815-16 Richard Willis bringing it over to the United States date. So 1810, 1815, 16 time frame. Yay, keyed bugles, but at the same time, you forget, the War of 1812 was kind of happening right in that time too, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's and a lot of musicians actually, like war in general, there were a lot of musicians that were employed in the military during that time. So it solidified some of the practices of American military musicians. People like Francis Johnson probably learned a lot of their trade as military people, or at least adjuncts, militia bands attached to a certain regiment.
Yeah, right. Definitely.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned Francis Johnson, and we've mentioned Richard Willis. Also, are there any other notable keyed bugle players that were around, kind of in the keyed bugle's heyday in the 1800s?
Yeah, I've got a couple hundred of them listed in my book. They were,
All right. So number one is
well, there's Kendall, and of course, but there were for every Kendall, for every Doc Severson, there are, 5,000 guys that want to be Doc Severson. So
yeah, true. That's very true.
So that's pretty much the situation there. The ones that had the paper trail, like Kendall and Johnson, who were widely touring and left playbills and reviews and newspaper advertisements and so forth. Those guys are the easy ones to research. It's a little harder to you have to get into family records and other kinds of things to pick out, get into some of the other guys, and do a little bit more genealogy work on some of those characters. But there were a lot of them. Gotcha. And I think I made a note to myself. There were 187 makers that I've been able to document.
Yikes!
Wow. And so, 187 makers are. I mean, how many trumpet makers do we have today in the United States, in the world actually? By comparison, this was a huge endeavor, and it was I think. When you point out, the number of people that you can find that were players, the number of people you can find that were makers, now we're finding a lot more music because of the cataloging practices being changed. In the old days, if there was an instrumentation list on something that a librarian was cataloging, he would just translate, or he or she would just translate the cornet or the whatever to a trumpet. They just put that in the cataloging records as trumpet. But now they're being a little bit more exact, and all this music is being digitized. You can see the titles of the actual instruments in their whatever local dialect it is, whether it's a trumpet a clay or cornetta, chave, that kind of stuff. Those those original titles are all showing up, and we're finding a lot more music now.
Awesome.
That we didn't think was there.
Yeah, great.
If the Keyed Bugle, because we've talked a little bit about how the advancements in instrument technology kind of flowed back and forth. Did those have like a noticeable effect on how the music of the time was composed? Like, can we see like any kind of discernible jump in level of difficulty now that you've got all these horns that are fully chromatic and working their way around?
That's a little hard question, because I don't think, outside of a couple of showpieces like Winslow Blues and Up Quickstep and things, I don't think the Keyed Bugle was thought of as a flashy instrument. At least in concert circles. Now, maybe in a band setting.
Yeah.
And also, by the time flashy cornet solo kind of stuff came around, those bands were a little bit too loud to blend very well with a good key bugle player.
Gotcha.
So you do see some of the older players still holding key bugles in some of the iconography of pre-Civil War bands, but it isn't too long after that you see almost all over-the-shoulder instruments and bell front E-flat players.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think there was at the end of the era there was less heterogeneous instrumentation than at the beginning of the era. During the time of Willis and the English and Irish things, say from that period of 1800 to 1820, there were a lot of mixed ensembles, things with flute and clarinet and keyed bugle and bassoon.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we're 35 episodes now into the Early American Brass Band podcast as a show, and we have actually not had the opportunity to talk about Ned Kendall to any great kind of length. So could you maybe give a little bit of background and context to Ned Kendall, and maybe we can use that as a way to segue into a piece like Up Quickstep, where we can hear your performance of that?
Well, Ned basically is the most documented key bugle player in the United States. He died of tuberculosis or consumption, as they called it then, and and as late as 1861, they were still giving tribute concerts for Ned Kendall. I got a poster in my collection here from where the D.C. and Rodolph Hall had a band in New York that were giving a benefit concert for him. He couldn't play anymore. So his memory he must have been a very charismatic player, because he's well documented. And in that Schwartz Bands of America, there's an account of him playing it with Gilmore, playing the Up Quickstep. Usually Up would be at the end of a program. Mm-hmm. I prefer to put my Ups at the beginning of the program.
Yeah, get it out of the way, right?
Yeah. And after doing a certain kind of warm up to set my chops a little higher, maybe this would be a good time to play Up, and then we can talk about it.
Sure.
This is from my 1980. I'm not 1984 recording called Music for Keyed Bugle, and I'm accompanied by the Miss Lucy Long Social Orchestra and Quickstep Society. So you can see from that recording that there's some flexibility going on with the keyed bugle. That's the keyed bugle playing the thing through A A B B C C D D with repeats, and you can imagine that when E flat cornet player would play the first phrase and it would be echoed by the keyed bugle player, that it might be even the most accomplished E flat cornetist would be challenged by that, because the instrument itself has an idiom that is more fluid. Mm-hmm. You have to really practice your flow studies on E flat cornet to match the lyrical and arch of the air that you can get on a keyed bugle. So it's I think that has a lot to do with the respect that Ned Kendall had. And Ned Kendall wasn't the only guy that could play this way. Was it D.C. Hall? Yeah, could play this. Eben Flagg could play this. and has it on his programs, and almost everybody at one point or other, once they became keyed bugle of a certain renown, had to sort of do it as an obligatory thing, just sort of like everybody has to play Virgin de la Macarena,
I was gonna say like the Carnival of Venice or something like
Yeah,
that.
Right.
It's that Carnival of Venice.
Yeah.
And actually, Carnival of Venice, is a Neapolitan song, and it was used as a key bugle variation.
Oh, well.
So there's some early programs that show that. So I had to find a version of Carnival of Venice that I could play that didn't go down to low G.
Yeah.
Only plays the key bugle. I didn't mention this, but the key bugle goes from B below middle C, B natural below middle C, up to as high as a regular trumpet player could play.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't go all the way down to the 1, 2, and 3 combination kind of thing.
Right. So you need either extra keys or a valve instrument to get to those low notes.
Does the largest number of keys on a keyed bugle, which I think you said is 12, does that extend down to a 1, 2, and 3 combination? Or
I look on those keys as a kind of a gateway to the pedal tone register, and I think they're not easy to play. You have to shift your left hand down to those keys from where you were playing E and F with your thumb and your forefinger of the left hand, and it's not an easy thing to do. I have an E flat one that has 10 keys. It's a Graves, and sometimes I use it as a way to get down to the pedal register. All keyed bugles have a really good pedal register, but there's a gap between that low B and the G. So you need a B flat, A natural, and A flat, and then you can play below that.
Gotcha.
Just using the natural fingerings, and it's a good it's a good way to, sometimes in a cadenza or something, I scare people by playing pedal tones.
There you go.
What the hell's going on?
We're so used to the I don't know if you want to call it the typical trumpet player, the Maynard mentality, trying to scream. So if you get somebody that's getting these pedal tones out, I guess it's a little scary.
It's exactly opposite think. You're in a think of bizarro world when you're playing the keyed bugle. Everything that a trumpet player's instincts tell him to do is the reverse.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Can you maybe talk to us for a second about this example that we're about to play, demonstrating the B flat keyed bugle?
Right. This is from an album that I did with the London Gabrieli Brass Ensemble, and Chris Larkin had discovered some of this music in an archive in Sweden, and he put together a huge recording project with some of the best London players. John Wallace is playing keyed bugle on this excerpt.
Cool.
I think he's playing second keyed bugle.
There you go.
And second Repiano keyed bugle. So I was in pretty good company there.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Steve Holloway is the other keyed bugle. So you'll actually hear 3 keyed bugles in here. I'm the solo keyed bugle, and the other guys are the Repiano. And then this is military music from the 18 teens in Sweden. So it would have been after the keyed bugle had spread to Europe, the late teens, after the Napoleonic Wars, and it was being taken up in Russia and Scandinavia and other places in military bands. So it's and Crucell is and Braun are the composers jointly. I think one did the Adagio and one did the variations, and they are more familiar to people who play the clarinet. My sister used to play Crucell on her clarinet when she was practicing in high school. So they're not usually thought of as, but there's a huge repertoire of this style of music in Scandinavia still today. So if somebody wanted to do a research on that, if you speak the Scandinavian languages, that would be a great area to research.
You had alluded a few times to different instruments in your collection. I think you might have mentioned earlier in the interview that your collection may extend beyond keyed bugles, but maybe we can use this opportunity to maybe talk about some instruments that you own that you might view as being like the gems of your collection, or anything that might be particularly notable or have some type of provenance.
Well, I have 3 Graves keyed bugles. Most of the time I'm playing the Graves Boston. That's my favorite one. Mm-hmm. And that has 10 keys. But I've got to be honest with you guys. I mostly use the 7 keys that make the instrument chromatic. I very seldom, unless I'm trying to do some kind of a stunt for a student or something, that I play the extra keys. So I have those 3 E flats, and I have another E flat by Firth Hall and Pond that was destroyed in a fire, and it was sold to me as just a burnt shell.
And burned recently, or back
a while back.
Gotcha.
And I got the shell. And I was originally just going to use the shell to measure the holes and things like that, because it was all exposed. Mm-hmm. And it was flattened. And Rob Stewart took that instrument and made a beautiful instrument with it. It looks, Rob has copied the Graves instruments in the Easy Write instruments.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it has a set of Graves keys on it. And if you look at it from a distance, you think that's a Graves keyed bugle.
Wow.
But it's a Firth Hall and Pond, and it plays really well. And B flats, I have one of my favorites, but it's not one I play, is a Graves. It's J. Keyed for Graves. Keyed was an English maker who worked for Key in London and came to the United States and joined the Graves shop. And he was making some instruments that were independent, and then he started using the Graves workshop, and then started calling it J. Keyed for Graves, and that's a beautiful instrument.
Nice.
I have a Percival B flat, an English one. I have a Mark Neukirchen instrument that has characteristics of the Vogtland makers. I have a French keyed bugle I just picked up recently. It's a Goutreau, but it's unmarked, but it has all the characteristics of the Goutreau instruments. And the one that I play is a 7-key unmarked instrument, but it's identical to signed Frederick Pace's.
I'm not familiar with that name.
Pace. Oh, you should know Pace. Pace was was an important Irish maker. He was one of the first licensees to make keyed bugles. And he and his sons moved to London, and Frederick was one of his sons. And they started making the royal patent keyed bugles, Halliday inventor, and you see that on the bell rims of hundreds of instruments. So,
Gotcha, that makes sense.
So pace was if you pick up a pace, you're gonna find it. It's probably a good instrument.
Gotcha.
Let's see. I have a Greenhill, who was another early English maker, and I think that's about the end of the list. Oh, I have a Baker. Baker was a flute maker in London, and I'm the only person I think I know that has a Baker.
Interesting.
Nice.
So there's about a dozen of them altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. You may have been alluding earlier that you have interest beyond Keyed Bugle. Does the collection kind of extend beyond the Keyed Bugle family, or is your collection habits kind of contained to just that?
No, it's kind of spiraled out of control.
Nice.
Every place, my wife and I love to travel, and we go to South America or Europe or whatever. We, always looking for instruments. So I have a lot of folk instruments from the world, Africa. Cool. I have a lot of folk brass instruments, lures from Scandinavia, and hornets, and instruments that are made out of animal horn and things like that from Africa. But I have a couple over-the-shoulder instruments and Civil War era instruments, and I think I have about 14 or so cornets. I have three cornopians that are also Goutreau, I think. They're unsigned, but have those characteristics. That was actually my museum job. I was a consultant for Instrument and Museum Schloss Kremsegg in Upper Austria, and my job was basically to try to identify some of the unmarked instruments in the collection.
Interesting.
So it was fascinating. That's why I got familiar with the Mark Neukirchen makers very early on, because I was working with Herbert Haida when the collection was in the United States, and he would take out an instrument and put it on the table and goes, Mark Neukirchen.
Good.
And
There you go.
how do you do that? How do you know that? And he would, he would sort of school me on some of the design features and so forth. And he had cataloged instruments in the Leipzig collection, and already knew, already had 30 years of history about identifying these instruments. So he was a great mentor to work with and study.
It could be a cool party trick, right? You're at a party and you just put down an unmarked instrument and see. Well,
actually, that happens a lot. People say I've come up with a paper bag at the end of a concert, and there's a keyed bugle in there, and what is this?
You shake it a little bit, listen, see.
And my response is, I don't know what it is, but I'll buy it off you for.
There you go. That's funny.
That is funny.
Out of curiosity, are there any instrument makers currently making any type of reproductions of keyed bugles?
Well, you guys are probably more familiar with Rob Stewart than anybody else, but there are. I think that Rob is the finest keyed bugle maker in the world, probably that's ever lived in the world. His instruments are beyond, the best that you can buy, that you can get it historically. I mean, so if you can get a Rob Stewart reproduction, it's worth the wait. I got introduced to Rob at a beautiful time when he was, still very, very active, and he was just getting interested in this stuff. And I traded him an Ophicleide for a restoration of 2 keyed bugles and a cornopian, that kind of thing.
There you go.
Yeah.
And Rob plays the keyed bugle a little bit, or at least did. And he was involved in some of the early keyed brass conferences that we had in the late 80s on the East Coast. So he's probably the best maker. I don't know of too many other people that are making instruments on a regular basis. I tried to work with Jürgen Vogt in Mark Neukirchen, and he had my instruments for a week and measured them very carefully, and he copied my pace and also an E flat, my E flat graves, but I think the museum bought those two instruments. I don't think he made instruments after that. So, unless they were on special order, and I found that I couldn't. They weren't exact copies of what we were doing. So it didn't turn out as well as it might have.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, but before we move on to any kind of closing thoughts, I did want to get your take on kind of what you see as like the importance or the value of kind of studying, these older instruments and this older music, in today's kind of classical music world that kind of really seems to be super forward looking and trying to innovate and do, what's the next like weird ensemble we can come up with for a composition. But, as someone who has, written a book and done an album and a ton of research on these old instruments, what's kind of your take on the value for, particularly younger, maybe like college aged musicians to really dive into this stuff?
Well, it's not a moneymaker, I'll tell you that. So I wouldn't sell the farm to buy a Keyed Bugle collection and write books.
Right.
But there is some interesting stuff. There's I think 80 or 90 method books that I've been able to locate, and they talk. Particularly the French ones are very insightful into phrasing. And if you do you guys play any of the Concone studies, the lyrical studies?
No,
on baritone.
not familiar. No.
He was a vocal teacher, Italian vocal teacher in Paris, and wrote several. Sight singing kind of things, and trumpet players play the Concone studies. So I got some of those, and actually Concone was an exact contemporary of the Keyed Bugle era, and so I'm starting to play some of those things on, and it's all about phrasing. It's all and his rules for Keyed Bugle methods expose.
Are they etudes or are they like songs, like the art of phrasing, Arbin type of stuff?
Yeah, they're songs without words. They're basically meant as a sight singing study. But they have
Gotcha.
They have nice piano accompaniments, and they work really well. So if you want to play they could be played on ophicleide, or they could be played on Keyed Bugle, or any number of instruments. Everybody benefits from playing nice lyrical pieces.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any benefit to playing on the instruments themselves, or do you think the largest takeaway is just the repertoire and the exercises from the period?
I had hoped originally that I would be like Christopher Monk, that I would have been able to inspire somebody to mass produce Keyed Bugles the way he did the cornetto, and that there'd be a lot of people playing Keyed Bugles and ophicleides throughout the world. I think ophicleide players have been more successful about promoting their instrument than Keyed Bugle players have. The ophicleide, because of French colonialism, had a wider distribution in many ways, and lasted longer. There were still catalogs in the ophicleides in the catalogs of up to World War I. So South America had ophicleides. They were playing there. There were Keyed Bugles in Mexico, by the way.
Oh, cool.
Finding out. And, but generally speaking, there was a more successful transmission of the instrument, and the revival consequently has been easier. And they have people that are making pretty decent reproductions of ophicleides apparently in places like China.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So that never happened with the Keyed Bugle, and I regret that. I wish I would have been more entrepreneurial about that in terms of a revival, because there is good music. There's a concerto by Heinrich that I recently played with an orchestra in California, February before last, and it's a good piece. So when we get to the promotional part, I'll
definitely, for sure. When you're playing Keyed Bugle with like orchestras and stuff like that, are you struggling at all with intonation? So I'm assuming a lot of these bugles are probably in high pitch, right?
Actually, no. The early Keyed Bugles are more. Most of them live very comfortably at 440.
Oh well.
And it wasn't high pitch. Came a little bit later than the heyday. There are Keyed Bugles that are in high pitch, but they were instruments that were made in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, interesting.
And so if you get a Keyed Bugle from the 20s, it's a pretty good bet that it's going to be 440. The problem with Keyed Bugles is finding out which is it's a hybrid instrument in the sense that it has a crook. So the instrument is, technically pitched in C, but it has a crook to B flat. Mm-hmm. Some of those instruments play better in B flat. They're obviously designed with their tone holes in mind to accommodate a B flat length, and some of them play better in C. So you have to make that determination. Mm-hmm. And then I just have a different size crook that I stick in for high pitch. So well, I played with the Saxons band.
Cool.
They were a 456 or something like that. They managed to come down a little bit, and I came up a little bit.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And used a short shank mouthpiece on it. And we got somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, there you
go. And the intonation is something you got to spend time with. Long tones, lots of alternate fingerings, and so you got to figure out the instrument.
Yeah, for sure. I know that we do have a number of college students that do listen to this show. Maybe as a closing thought, do you have maybe any suggestions or words of encouragement to maybe college students who may be interested in either acquiring a Keyed Bugle, learning Keyed Bugle, or just getting into the research area of Keyed Bugle early brass?
If you get a Keyed Bugle, find one with 7 keys and make friends with a good instrument technician who is familiar with woodwind key work. And the most successful pads that I have used are the Rob Stewart variety, which are the suede side of a single sheet of leather on the outside. So the suede out, rather than saxophone pads or clarinet pads or whatever. They have a tendency to be too thick and they interfere with your intonation.
Gotcha.
So the keys have to work like a good woodwind instrument, and it takes someone who can fiddle with the steel springs that they have. Some of them have iron springs, they're original, and they're tricky. So you have to get a good regulated instrument. That takes time, and it might take as much as you paid for the instrument itself to get it restored properly so it can play well for you. And then there are ways that you can test the instrument to make sure that it plays at a pitch level. I think it's easier to play with 440 from my perspective, at least playing with modern string players and pianists and stuff like that. I'm working on a recording project right now in the initial stages. I've got the repertoire list, and I'll be going in the studio in a month doing some solo unaccompanied pieces. But the rest of it's for piano and string quartet. There's a lot of music out there, and I think as librarianship improves and continues to be more specific about instrumentation lists, you're going to find plenty of stuff to research. And and the other thing I would encourage young trumpet players and people that were interested in these kind of instruments to do is to find a niche. you know, don't be afraid to be different for a while. People might not appreciate it right away, but after a while it'll pay off. So work on the basics, and that includes the basics of research. Finding, making networks in libraries and conservatories and places that might have this material.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Cool.
This has been a fantastic conversation. We really thank you for your time. Where can people go if they're curious about any of the recordings that you've done, maybe, or you wrote a book on the Keyed Bugle? So where can people find all of that stuff if they're interested in diving deeper into anything that we talked about today?
Okay. The book is called The Keyed Bugle, and you want to get the second edition. First edition is pretty much out of date. I doubled the material in the second edition. I'm currently working on a third edition, but don't wait for that, because I'm 72 years old and I might not finish it.
No, don't say that.
You'll finish it.
You just want people to buy it twice, right?
Yeah, absolutely buy it twice.
Yeah.
And then when I was working for the museum in Austria, I wrote a book called Das Flugelhorn. It's our collection from the Streitfeser collection in Instrumentenmuseum Schloss Kremsegg, and that is all the conical brass instruments that belong to the flugelhorn family. So it's not just flugelhorns and keyed bugles, it's euphoniums and all kinds of inner things. It has huge, it's a kind of a coffee table book.
Right.
There's beautiful pictures. One of my students called it flugelhorn porn.
There you go.
The photographs are still...
Yeah, so clear for sure.
Right.
And so those, I think you can get Das Flugelhorn at the the PV Median is the publisher, but it has an ISBN number, so you could probably get it over Amazon. My Keyed Bugle is published by Scarecrow Press, and the second edition you want to get, and that also can be purchasased through Amazon or the publisher Scarecrow Press. So if you go on those websites, they'll be happy to take your money.
For sure.
I have extra the website for the Das Flugelhorn. By the way, that book is both in English and in German. English is the second language of Austria.
Great.
In the museum business, so it's bilingual, and you don't have to worry. But the website you buy it from is German, and
Gotcha.
Some people are put off by having to do business in German, and it's not immediately apparent how you buy it. So I have about 10 copies that if someone wanted to contact me, I'd be happy to sell it at a radically reduced thing, and they wouldn't have to pay the shipping from Europe.
Awesome.
So people can contact me at Ralph.Dudgeon, Dudgeon, at Cortland, CORTLAND.edu. I also have a method book for the Keyed Bugle that I wrote in I think it's published in the second edition of that was 87. So that's a little... that has a lot of the main repertoire of the instrument in it, and a lot of practice things that come out of earlier method books.
Nice.
And of course, anybody has any, I give Zoom lessons on Keyed Bugle and other instruments, and be happy to Zoom with somebody that was serious about learning the instrument. So
awesome. Yeah. Is that method book available anywhere online, or is that directly through you also?
It's pretty obscure. I had in the 80s I had a little self-publishing project that I did out of my attic, and basically it was everything that I did for my school groups, or we had a Renaissance band called Sonare, and Miss Lucy Long Quickstep Society. We just published that stuff as we did it. So the Keyed Bugle book is called The Keyed Bugler's Companion, and you can get it directly from me.
Okay, great. Excellent. We will be sure to include any links, and your email address. We'll include that on our show notes on our website, as well as in the YouTube description. If people are listening to this on YouTube, we'll make sure to make it as easy as possible to find all these things and to get in contact with you.
Great.
Definitely.
Well, we can't thank you enough, Dr. Dudgeon, for taking the time this afternoon, to speak with us about your musical background, about your experiences in historic brass and the Keyed Bugle. So thank you so much. And
Well, you're quite welcome. It was a pleasure to meet and talk with both of you.
Thank you again so much to Dr. Ralph Dudgeon for coming onto the Early American Brass Band podcast. We have been on the air for almost a year exactly, and we are super excited to finally have the opportunity to have Dr. Dudgeon on and to be able to talk more in depth about the Keyed Bugle, kind of the instrument that helped spark the American brass band movement in the 1830s. So thank you again, and Stephen, take it away.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I'm very glad that we can have him on. You can visit our website for show notes for this episode that have links to a lot of the resources that he mentioned in the episode. And also up there in the show notes, we always have a featured album for every episode. So the one for this episode is Antique Brasses. This is the London Gabrieli Brass Ensemble with Christopher Larkin conducting. We played an excerpt in the episode from this album, the Carl Braun and Bernard Croussel Adagio and Polonaise for solo keyed bugle and brass. So you heard a little bit of this album already, but it's got a whole bunch of other music on it. We've got, what do we got here? 27 tracks in total. So there's some Salieri, there's more Croussel, there's Beethoven, and a lot of other good stuff on this album. So you can find that on it's released on the Hyperion label. You can find it directly on their website. We'll have it linked in the show notes. You can just download the MP3s. You can pay for it right through the record label, which is always good. That way you don't have to go through Amazon and give up more of your hard-earned cash to the machine that is Amazon. you can support the label directly. And the transition music in this episode comes from Dr. Dudgeon's solo album, Music for Keyed Bugle. And those tracks were the Lucy Long Quickstep and the Bugle Quickstep. You can purchase that album by emailing Dr. Dudgeon, and his email address is up on our show notes.
We look forward to sharing part 2 of our Keyed Brass March with you all. Next week we'll have Andy Kershaw talking about the ophicleide, kind of the lower counterpart to the Keyed Bugle. So tune back in for our next episode where we'll be talking with him about that. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you then.